What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So, Final Fantasy 15 was my first Final Fantasy. There is a good reason for this, as my gaming journey really starts with the Nintendo 64 back in the late 90s, which of course happened to be when Final Fantasy pivoted from Nintendo to PlayStation. And since I stuck with Nintendo pretty much exclusively for my formative years, I didn't reliably have access to other Final Fantasy games. But contrary to what many will say, in that Final Fantasy 15 is probably not the greatest starting point ever, even though they do indicate it literally from the get-go as a Final Fantasy for fans and first-timers. I was not so ignorant that I didn't understand that 15 was very different, even for a series that does change and experiment very heavily, especially so since the turn of the century. But despite Final Fantasy 15 being the first Final Fantasy game I played, I was familiar with a lot of very famous elements of the series prior. There are certain aspects to Final Fantasy that were just unavoidable, like certain infamous spoilers from FF7, the laughing scene from Final Fantasy X, as misunderstood as it largely is, etc. and so on. Going into Final Fantasy 15 originally, when it first came out on my Xbox, which I guess I didn't note, since Xbox offered backwards compatibility at a certain point into the Xbox One generation, I saw that as an opportunity to be able to play a lot of 360 titles and even original Xbox titles that I had missed, being a primarily Nintendo gamer for the first damn near 2 decades of my life. And so Final Fantasy 15 being a new Final Fantasy release that happened to be coming to Xbox as well, I took the plunge and jumped right into it. I can't say I remember too much from my original playthrough, but I do remember enjoying it quite a bit. Granted, 2016 was kind of a slow year for me, gaming-wise, at least as far as new releases, so that may have contributed to my willingness to commit to Final Fantasy 15, because I believe I actually got all of the achievements in the base game. I remember getting 1,000 gamer score. I don't know why I felt so compelled to do that, but I guess again because it was a pretty slow year for new releases for me, in addition to kind of getting caught up in the achievement thing for those first couple years that I started playing on Xbox, since achievements were new to me. But despite all that, I was aware of Final Fantasy 15's reputation, in that it was kind of disjointed, and therefore the story was pretty messy and missing things that may or may not be present in other media, like the Kingsglaive movie. As the years went on, and I got further and further removed from Final Fantasy 15, I saw that the DLC episodes were releasing, which once the Windows Edition released, which is kind of like the Game of the Year edition for PC, I picked it up on sale, of course, and also grabbed the episode Ardyn DLC for like, I think $2 or $3 to re-experience Final Fantasy 15 in its most complete state. And I find that while it was an admirable effort putting out these DLC episodes to try to patch up FF15's very patchwork, disjointed story, I don't think it was enough. Now, what I don't want to do with this video is painstakingly break down each and every plot point that I wasn't a fan of or thought was missing something or like whatever. So I wanted to kind of synthesize my points and give kind of a more big picture view of my problems with FF15, because I'm sure you can find painstaking dissections of this game that are way longer than they need to be elsewhere. And I am aware that this game was in development hell for a long time, and so this is no slight on the developers themselves. I really just want to judge the product as it is, without having to worry about hurting anyone's feelings. Presentation-wise, the game's gorgeous. The English dub is pretty damn well done, I think. Generally, I find the game to be pretty well written from a dialogue standpoint, more so when dealing with the banter between the 4 bros, being of course Noctis, Gladiolus, Ignis, and Prompto. These characters didn't really strike me as strongly this time around. I do think the dynamic is nice, but I would be hard-pressed to put any of these guys in a list of my favorite Final Fantasy characters. And that's not to say that they don't have potential to be better, it's just the way that this game's story was told did a great disservice to pretty much everything else. The soundtrack is obviously well composed and performed and all that, but I find that it kind of lacks cohesion, not necessarily in the manner of using leitmotifs. I don't think that's always necessary to make a cohesive soundtrack. It's just more so that the soundtrack kind of feels like it lacks an identity, maybe because it goes for more of a movie score kind of vibe, which I find to generally be forgettable. Obviously, movie scores are meant to complement what is happening on screen, not distract from it, but outside of a handful of tracks, I don't feel particularly strongly about the OST here, especially so considering the highs this series has when it comes to music. Character-wise, I already mentioned the main quartet. I will say the DLC episodes do help flesh out their motivations and personalities more. It's just kind of too little too late on that front. While the effort is appreciated, I just don't think it does enough. If these stories were directly implemented into the story instead of being a separate menu item you select outside of it, then maybe, but I feel like that would probably only add to the disjointed nature of the game because of the different gameplay styles. It would just need to be completely built differently from the beginning. And so it's just all the more disappointing to see any inkling of potential this game has, because if I had to guess, it's probably never going to be fully realized. While I do think the main party is done as well as they could be, given the context, I think my favorite characters are the temporary party members, being Corleonis and RNA Highwind. Those characters just strike me way more personality-wise and has me wanting to know more about them. It might be due to the fact that this game is so haphazard that maybe limiting their screen time is to their benefit. They do get some more screen time in certain DLC episodes, but I still want to see more. Shit, this is one of those games that I think if they did spin-offs of it, they could potentially be better than the base game. And the main other character that I need to talk about, of course, is Ardyn, who is the main antagonist of FF15. I think Ardyn has charisma going for him, which can be a big factor in crafting a compelling villain. I don't think it's completely necessary, but it does definitely help, especially given the nature of this story being pretty haphazard and incomplete. Not that the story is inconclusive, there is a definitive end, but there's just a lot of gaps that should have been filled in more cohesively. Aside from the charisma factor, I don't really find Ardyn to be that compelling of a villain. I feel like that episode Ardyn DLC was a big missed opportunity. I was kind of anticipating it showing the very origins of his character, like him 2,000 years or whatever prior to the events of the game, not him storming into Insomnia in an event that clearly would have been remembered in recent history, but it was somehow brushed under the rug and no characters brought it up in the main story. Very poorly done, I think. And I also find that Ardyn's sympathetic backstory feels very forced. I don't feel sympathetic for him retroactively, like at all. If this was presented more upfront, like maybe if this game actually had exposition, which I can't believe I'm saying that because sometimes stories have too much exposition, but this is an instance where this game really could have benefited from actual exposition. Like even if it was just setting up the lore, right? The 6 gods watch over the world of Eos, and there was once a man who is known as the Adagium who was purifying those tainted by the darkness or whatever the fuck, but he became tainted himself and so had to be sealed away. Even something as simple as that would have been enough to have me intrigued, and then maybe when Ardyn shows up, you're like, huh, is that the Adagium that they mentioned? Even if it was mentioned in Kingsglaive, like I'm not watching a fucking movie to get context in a game that should have told its story from stem to stern within the game. I'm judging the game as its own individual product. And so if the game was structured better, do I think that Ardyn could have been a far more compelling villain? Sure. But as it stands, I didn't find him to be particularly strong this time around, aside from the charisma. And there are some scenes where he does steal the show for sure because of that charisma, but outside of that, I'm not really impressed with the way that he was handled. The first 2/3 of the game probably is an open world segment, which is not surprising given the time period in which this game was developed, but not only do I feel incredibly burnt out on open world games, with rare exception, I don't find this to be a particularly well executed open world anyway. The initial concept, which gets derailed, is that this game is a road trip kind of bachelor party with the boys. Shit does hit the fan pretty early on and prevents the road trip from really happening in its original intended manner. Despite that, there is a very heavy road trip aesthetic happening here. It feels very Western in that fashion and is trying to capture the grand landscapes of North and South America, I suppose. And I guess Europe to some extent, but that's less so in the open world and more so in areas like Altissia. I think the main thing that this open world fails at is making traversal interesting, even in the slightest. As central of a mechanic as the Regalia is supposed to be, it doesn't really feel like it serves the game meaningfully aside from that road trip aesthetic. Refueling and fast travel is so fucking cheap and exploitable that it doesn't even feel like it needs to be there, especially once you're able to fast travel at night. And so, okay, rebuttal, don't fast travel, but then have fun just sitting in the car, doing nothing, hearing conversations that you've already heard over and over again. It would be even more of a drag if you didn't fast travel, but fast traveling undermines the entire road trip kind of setup. So I think this game being open world to begin with was a bad idea from the get-go, even though you would think an open world would lend itself well to a road trip. I actually think a more linear, hub-based structure would have been better, where you have the road trip segments where you're just driving on an open road and you have handcrafted dialogue for that particular segment, and then you arrive at a particular town or city or whatever it is. because maybe you make camp along the way, and then you wouldn't have needed for refueling to be a mechanic, which again, it's barely a mechanic. It's literally fucking 5 gil to fill up the tank, which you don't even need to do like very often at all. Such a waste. Add to this, most of what you're doing in the open world is the side quests, and they kind of blow ass. Most of them boil down to fetch quests, which granted, a lot of side quests in many games are fetch quests, but even side quests that are fetch quests can be compelling if there are interesting character moments or lore to make up for it just being a fetch quest, which is not really present here. And the way they're presented on the map further incentivize fast travel, since you can only really view one at a time. You can't like plot a route that goes from one side quest to the other. You have to kind of manually scroll through them and figure out which ones are close to each other. The map UI just is another thing. At least you can turn off certain icons, but being able to select multiple side quests and being able to kind of route a road trip through multiple of them so you can tackle them on your way to maybe the next main quest destination would have been a huge benefit to leveraging the open world road trip kind of stuff. And if there's a way to do this in this game, then yeah, let me know, correct me. But as far as I'm aware, as someone who's played through this game twice now, I don't think there's a way to do that. Now let's talk about the story itself. It really is just one of those things of a story that has potential but was squandered. I generally like this early section of the game. Noctis and crew getting stopped from taking the boat, into Insomnia falling, Noctis's dad getting killed, and the treaty between the Empire and Lucis being broken and stuff like that. And then Noctis and crew doubling back to Insomnia to either figure out what's going on or try to save now his people from suffering, since he kind of inherits the title of king. And then Kor shows up, tells Noctis, hey, if you want to fight back with the Empire, you got to get the sacred weapons that are from your ancestors, and they're in these tombs. And so, okay, the game becomes, instead of the road trip to the wedding, it becomes a road trip to try to hit these tombs in the most efficient manner possible. I think maybe even pinning multiple tombs on the map outright, instead of going from one to the other in more of a scripted fashion, maybe would have been better. For lack of a better term, though it is apt, I feel the story kind of spins its wheels for a little bit too long in the open world. And you know, you have Talcott and Jared that show up, and then Jared gets killed off screen, but you're not really familiar enough with him to really care that he was killed, even though I feel bad for Talcott because like he's a child and his grandfather was killed in front of him, but you don't see that and you don't really have a bond with these characters. I feel bad about not feeling bad, but at the same time, I just don't really care. There's some tomb investigation stuff, and there's some other shit that happens. Gladio goes off because he gets humiliated by Ravus, and then he comes back to help with the power plant, which I thought was going to be more apparent in episode Gladio, but it just wasn't. He just randomly shows up at the power plant, but without explicitly saying that he's Gladio, but Noctis knows that it's him because it's obviously his voice. But then it's just generally you get on the boat and you go to Altissia, and that's pretty much it, if you're not doing side quests, which I regrettably did a lot of the side quests. And by virtue of that, I did end up pretty over leveled, but by the end game it didn't matter too much, and the combat in this game is just not really that interesting to me. But before I get into that, I do find the political undertones in the Altissia segment to be kind of enjoyable, if poorly executed, and then Luna dying just doesn't really make sense in the moment. I know she was dying and then Ardyn stabs her, and like I don't know if Noctis knew that she was dying already, but I don't really buy their relationship because it's just not built up enough to begin with. I feel bad for Noctis because you're with him from the very beginning, but it just doesn't have the emotional impact I think they wanted because of that lack of build-up. Leviathan gets pissed that they were awoken by the one person in the lore that is meant to commune with the gods. And so like, why are you surprised that the one character that is meant to commune with the gods is communing with the gods? That makes no fucking sense. At the end of the Altissia segment, Ignis goes blind because he puts on the Ring of Lucis to try to protect Noctis. Would have been cool to see this in the main game, not in a side story that is intended to be played after the fact because it spoils some major things for later in the original story, but whatever. I actually kind of enjoyed the train portions of this. The whole thing with Gladiolus being pissed at Noct for not getting over Luna's death and not, you know, being very kingly in his wanting to press forward and get the job done, and also not being considerate of Ignis being blind now was, I mean, pretty enjoyable, honestly. I do think the Ardyn illusion thing with Prompto was kind of weird. It's kind of funny because playing it a second time, now it's clear that that was Prompto based on the way he's talking, even though he looks like Ardyn in Noctis's eyes. I know Ardyn can manipulate how people see him, but is this the only time where he has someone else being viewed as him? That particular facet of his powers I feel like is not leveraged as much as it would be if that was something that he has outside of this one scene. But generally the whole train Glacian kind of stuff was pretty cool. Like when Gentiana shows up and Ardyn is like being his charismatic, witty, fucking fedora tipping self, and then she just like taps him on the lips with her finger and he freezes in place. And then you get to the dreaded chapter 13, of course. Now what was added thanks to the DLC and the other characters having their own gameplay styles was being able to not play as Noctis and instead of play as Gladio with Ignis in tow, which I chose this time because I already played the Noctis segment the first time through years ago, and yeah, it was pretty annoying. I don't think I hated it as much as a lot of people did, but I probably would dislike it a lot more now. Story-wise, just lots of missed potential, like the Emperor being fully turned into a demon, but him viewing that as like peak human performance, and really that being his goal at a certain point because he got corrupted or some shit. He's like, yes, the demons are the all-powerful and we need to be like them or whatever, and that's why he's trying to taint the world and fill it with darkness, but it's really Ardyn pulling the strings. But I don't feel like they leverage the puppet master kind of elements of Ardyn fully, at least on screen, which is kind of important. Show, don't tell and all that. Noctis goes into the crystal. Ardyn kind of reveals somewhat his motivation, which I thought was enough. Again, I feel like episode Ardyn kind of ruined some of that in some ways. Like it didn't expound on the aspects that needed to be expounded on, at least as much as they should have been. But anyhow, 10-year time skip, which is when the multiplayer takes place. I don't really care for Noctis's design post time skip, but yeah, he's got facial hair to indicate that he's older or whatever. I'm surprised he couldn't grow a fuller beard in 10 years, but whatever. It's kind of enjoyable that Talcott picks him up, but Talcott's like old now. Turns out the world's been covered in darkness the whole time, so people have had to do what they can to survive with demons roaming around the world at all times. I guess I skipped over episode Prompto, but I encountered a glitch in episode Prompto where it wouldn't let me interact with things past like the halfway point, and so I just stopped because I didn't really care for what was happening that much anyhow. Although I did find myself caring for Prompto more as a character in the DLC than in the base game. And it kind of explains his more moody presence when he comes back and joins up with the party in Gralia. And RNA is the GOAT, obviously. But anyhow, the finale to this game I think is actually pretty well done, all things considered. It would have been even more impactful if there was actual exposition and portions of the story were actually present in the story and not outside of it. But I think they added some bosses towards the end too, since I don't remember them being there, and you also are forced to play as the other party members for the end portions of the bosses. I thought that was pretty fun, actually, even though I'm about to criticize the gameplay pretty heavily in a few seconds. There were some emotional scenes after the fact, like the campfire scene, which I'm kind of torn if I think it would be better if that scene was actually when it happened instead of flashing back to it after Noctis sacrifices himself, which brings me to the whole Star Scourge, Noctis having to sacrifice himself thing. Feels like it just comes out of left field halfway through the story. The days are getting shorter, but that's not really apparent in like the first half of the game. I don't know why this wasn't mentioned earlier on as maybe a reasoning for Noctis and Lunafre to get married. Not only to join the nations together, but because you have the Oracle who can commune with the gods, and you have Noctis who is the King of Kings or whatever they call him, the last king of Lucis, who is intended to sacrifice himself to get rid of the Star Scourge, but the Star Scourge isn't brought up until like more than halfway through the game, so I'm not really sure what the fuck is going on with this game's story, man. I get it in retrospect. It's not that I don't understand, it's just that it's poorly executed. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's criticized this game's story. I know for a fact I'm not. But I just can't be bothered to like listen to every radio broadcast and read every newspaper that's in the game to try to maybe get an inkling of lore or like what's actually fucking happening and what is supposed to be apparently the crux of the game's story, but is not even brought up by the main characters until at least halfway through. Now, moving into the gameplay, I've enjoyed relatively simple action combat systems in the past, due to having some kind of depth to make up for the lack of complexity, simply feeling fun and or satisfying to play, or some combination of those two factors. But this game borderline feels like it plays itself. It's not even that you can spam the attack button, you can literally just hold the attack button, and it just kind of does it for you. Of course, you gotta guard every once in a while, so if you hold attack and guard at the same time, occasionally releasing attack when you're getting swarmed, you're gonna do just fine. There is the occasional parry QTE, but because these are QTEs, they don't feel as satisfying to pull off aside from like sound design. Add to that the main semblance of difficulty being the amount of damage enemies do and how spongy they are, and it just doesn't lead to a very compelling combat system, at least prior to the post game. I do think those bosses in the finale were pretty fun to fight, but pretty much everything prior to that was not really that noteworthy. I did think the magic system was neat, and plus it could obliterate 9 out of 10 enemy encounters instantly, so it allowed me to skip a lot of enemy encounters encounters that I didn't want to participate in. You can issue commands to your party, but you kind of just have to sit around and watch them do it. You can't jump from party member to party member. Well, I mean, you can if you unlock those perks, but I think that when you give commands, I would assume that it still forces you to watch the animation. And also sometimes those animations have such a long windup that they don't end up being performed until the enemy is out of the way already. They will sometimes home in on enemies, but it just doesn't feel all that great to play. I think I kind of get what they were going for with Noctis's fighting style, where he's pretty avoidant and he's like warping around and shit, which granted the warp strike stuff is pretty fun unless you're fighting Leviathan, in which it's very annoying, but I can't help but think that there's a better way to execute that style of combat than what they opted to do with just holding the button to do the thing. It's not even timed presses like you get in even the simplest of action games. I will say that playing as Gladiolus was fairly enjoyable. At least you had some sort of combos you could do. Ignis was maybe even more autopilot than Noctis was, where I found I was just kind of holding the attack button for extended periods and it was dealing with mobs no problem. Promptos was an admirable attempt to make a third-person shooter in a game that just didn't have any semblance of those mechanics prior to that DLC, but as a third-person shooter, I just wasn't really convinced by it. A fun change of pace, I guess, but beyond that, not really feeling it. And then honestly, I couldn't even tell you how Ardyn played. I just kind of want to block that DLC out of my mind. Where does that leave Final Fantasy 15 to me? Not in a great light. Do I think it's the worst game ever? No. But given the budget and the publisher, I do expect more. At least it released to some capacity and they were able to move on from it, but it just feels like a lot of wasted effort. Does that mean the game's irredeemable? No. There are aspects that are enjoyable, like the group dynamic, some late game and probably post game boss fights, even certain story elements I kind of enjoyed, but as an overall package, this is not a game that I see myself coming back to, maybe ever. Certainly not for a long ass time. I just don't really feel a connection to like pretty much anything happening in this game. At least enough for it to warrant a full third playthrough at some point. Granted, if I skipped a lot of the side quests, it would be a shorter experience. Not that it was super long this time around anyway. I think it was like 30 hours when it was all said and done-ish, including maybe an hour for each of the DLC episodes, so maybe the main game was like 25 or something, which definitely could have been shorter without side quest filler. And plus I wouldn't have been as over-leveled. Maybe I would have had to engage in the combat a little more, but even if for the early to mid game I wasn't over leveled, I don't really feel like I would have seen the combat in much more of a positive light. So those are my at least relatively concise thoughts on Final Fantasy 15. I am curious to hear from you in the comments, even if you do like this game quite a bit. I'm not trying to disparage your opinion or anything like that. I really don't like being overly negative in videos, believe it or not. It just so happens that this is a high profile release in a franchise that I want to talk about on the channel that I just don't particularly care for. As far as Final Fantasy content going forward, I've mentioned before that I want to go back and play the Pixel remasters, which I do still plan to do, but that is going to be a very long-term project. So I wouldn't expect for that to happen too soon after this video comes out, but that will likely be what I do next, since otherwise I'll just be waiting on PC ports of 16 and 7 Rebirth. So don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, of course, if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.